Hello students, I am Snehal Hegiste, Associate Professor in English. Today I welcome you in the class of BA Special English and paper number 7. Today I want to introduce you new paper and name of that paper is Introduction to Literary Criticism. Number of paper is 7. Paper number 7. You are studying this paper for your semester 5. The old title for this paper was Literary Criticism and Critical Appreciation. But now title has changed from this year. Even syllabus is also changed. Name of or title of this paper is Introduction to Literary Criticism. So important word from this title we can discuss. That one is of a criticism. Earlier I have discussed a chapter from language and linguistics. So name of that paper was language and linguistics and name of this paper is literary criticism. So criticism. The term criticism is normally used to mean judgment. For another word for judgment is appreciation, evaluation, assessment. So term criticism is normally used to mean judgment or evaluation. So we here role of the literary critic is very important. So literary critic is a literary judge. So for criticism, we are now here discussing this word in the concern of literary criticism. So the term criticism for our purpose is concerned with literary writing such as drama, novel, poetry, short story, epic and critical book. So creative literature means just we have discussed drama, poetry, short story. These are the various forms of art, and creative literature is defined as a interpretation of life through various forms of art, and criticism can be called interpretation of interpretation. So literary criticism is a journey of exploration into the nature of literature in all its forms. So what is the function of literary criticism? It helps us to understand difference between good book and a bad book. It helps us to recognize literary qualities. So literary criticism is an attempt to say something either positively or negatively about a work of literature. Work of literature means forms of literature. There are various forms of literature: novel, poetry, drama, short story, etc. So criticism helps us to judge literary genre. It opens up the whole world of pleasure. And what is the task of the critic? Critic helps us easing or widening or deepening our response to literature. So after discussing in brief the word criticism or the nature of the criticism, I want to discuss today module number 2, and name of the module number 2 is classical criticism. So just we have discussed what is meant by criticism. Again I will again I explain the term criticism means judgment. Criticism means evaluation of literary form. Literary forms like novel, poetry, drama, etc. So while discussing classical criticism particularly focuses on the concept of the tragedy. What is tragedy? Tragedy is a form of a drama. Drama is divided into two parts, tragedy and comedy. But classical criticism gives us a concept of tragedy. While discussing concept of the tragedy, we can begin with Plato. Plato was the first Greek critic who examined poetry as a part of his moral philosophy. He was a philosopher, he was a thinker, and while discussing his particularly philosophy, he examined poetry as a part of his moral philosophy. When he is talking about moral philosophy, he judged poetry. His critical observations are found in his different books, and in these books he stated poetry as a genuine piece of imaginative literature. Genuine means what? Genuine, real. Genuine piece of imaginative literature, but in his Republic is a book written by Plato. In his Republic, he rejects poetry on moral and philosophical grounds. According to Plato, poetry is immoral. So he has rejected poetry on the grounds of moral and philosophical aspects. He has rejected poetry, and for him, poetry is immoral and imitative in nature. Imitative means copying. You can copy from someone or somewhere. So it is not genuine, it is imitative according to Plato. So these are the two important words. Poetry is immoral, poetry is imitative in nature. So these are the views of Plato about poetry. Now we are discussing in this chapter concept of tragedy, and while talking about concept of tragedy, we can focus on philosophy of Aristotle. Who is Aristotle? Aristotle was the most distinguished disciple. Disciple, we can say in simple word, a student of Plato. He was a critic. Aristotle was a critic, scholar, logician, and practical philosopher. He is also philosopher, keep in mind. He is known for his critical treatise. Treatise means his book. What is the name of his critical treatise? The Poetics, which deals with poetry. Again, he is talking about poetry like his master Plato. In his work, he has described the characteristics of tragedy, comedy, and epic. What is meant by epic? For example, we have Ramayana, Mahabharata. These are the epics. Epic is a longer poem. Epic is a longer form of a poetry which talks about heroic characters. Okay, so Aristotle in his work has described characteristics of, first thing, one is tragedy, second one is comedy and epic. Aristotle's The Poetics gives us full length of discussion on tragedy. So Aristotle's book The Poetics is very important for us, which gives discussion on tragedy. While discussing tragedy, it gives us detailed analysis of tragedy and its component parts. His analysis is based on tragedies of Greek dramatists. Aristotle defined tragedy as follows. What is the definition given by Aristotle? Tragedy then is an imitation. Again, same word, imitation here. Imitation of what? Imitation of an action. Tragedy is an imitation of an action, and that action must be serious, that action must be complete and of a certain magnitude. Magnitude, it must have a weightage. Okay, it should not be light, it should be magneted. For magneted we say udatt. Okay, that is serious by nature. It should talk about particularly serious factor of life. It should not be humorous. Serious, opposite word, humorous. Okay. So tragedy should talk, actually, according to Aristotle, tragedy is a imitation. Imitation, anukaran. You copy. It is not original. It is an imitation of what? Of action. Very important word is action. Tragedy is an action, and that action should be serious. One thing, there should not be any humor or comedy. That is serious. That is complete. It should be complete. There should not be short part. It should be complete, and that action should have certain magnitude. Magnitude, you say in Marathi, udatt. In language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament. Artistic ornament, dagine, you say in Marathi, ornaments. But these are the artistic ornaments. These are not physical ornaments that we wear on our body, but these are particularly artistic ornaments. We have ornaments of language that talk about similes, metaphors, and personification. Language is ornamented here with all these particularly elements. The several kinds being found in separate parts of the play. The several kinds being, several kinds means there are various kinds, types means what? Types being found in a separate parts of the play in the form of action. So there are again several or various kinds or parts that we find in the separate parts of the play. uh, Play covers, some plays covers 2 acts, 3 acts, 5 acts, act number 1, act number 2, act number 3. Okay, these are the parts of the play in the form of action, not of narrative, through pity and fear. So very important words are here. You are talking about, when you talk about this tragedy, first of all keep in mind, note down that tragedy is an imitation of an action. So very important point is here, tragedy is an imitation of action. Imitation, anukaran. Which word is very important? Action. It is an imitation of action. And that, what are the important adjectives used for action? Action should be serious, action should be complete, action should have certain magnitude. Okay, so these are the important 3 qualities that your action should cover. Which one? Seriousness, completeness, and magnitudeness. Certain magnitude in language, that language should be embellished. Okay, it is decorated with particularly artistic ornaments, that similes and metaphors and personifications. The several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, so there is a opportunity, there is a scope for other parts also, other kinds that are found in separate parts in the play in the form of action, not of narrative. Again, second part of this definition is that of a through pity and fear. So these 2 words are very important. That action should create these, particularly cover these 2 emotions, pity and fear, effecting the proper purgation. Very important thing is that proper purgation of emotions, of these emotions. Which are that these emotions? Pity and fear. Pity we say daya, fear bhiti. There are particularly emotions that particularly dominant our mind, which are that one? Pity and fear. So action of tragedy, okay, should cover what this should cover? Action. Okay, and in the second part of this definition we are talking about The emotions like fear and pity aroused here, and our this in this definition, Aristotle tells that there should be proper purgation, purgation, purification. Purgation means what here? Purification of these emotions. So, which these emotions are there? Pity and fear. Through tragedy, there should be purgation of emotions like pity and fear. These two emotions should be purgated. These two emotions should be purified through action of the tragedy. So this definition has two parts. One, nature of the tragedy. First of all, it talks about nature of the tragedy. What is tragedy? Tragedy is an imitation of an action, and that action must be serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. It should be presented in a decorative language using linguistic ornaments. Okay, so this is the first part that talks about nature of tragedy and distinction between tragedy and other forms of poetry. In the second part, it talks about function of tragedy. What is the function of tragedy? The function and the emotional effects of tragedy. Just we have discussed that there are two emotions, okay, which are the two emotions, fear and pity and fear. Through pity and fear effect in the proper purgation of these emotions. These two emotions should be purified, purgated, okay, through tragedy. So in tragedy, the object of imitation are serious actions. Now here we can compare and contrast tragedy and comedy. In tragedy, objects of imitation are serious actions, whereas in comedy imitates non-serious actions. So in comedy we find comic incidents, but on the other hand in tragedy we find serious actions, concern about death or serious things uh, that are discussed in tragedy. Thus, objects of imitation are different in each art. Objects of imitation. So, theory of imitation is again here highlighted. In poetry, some poets present men better than reality, or they as they are, So, we are talking about poetry. In poetry, some poets present men better than. Men better than means idealization, adarshavad. Okay, actually man is a combination of good and bad, but poet or writer has a particularly freedom to present him or her according to his imagination. So in some poetry men are presented better than reality, or as they are means as real. They are combination of good and bad. They may be presented lower than reality. This is the third fact. More than lower than reality. So these are the three things. Idealization. Second thing, you should present them as they are, or they may be presented lower than reality. It is a basic difference between tragedy and comedy. Tragedy presents men better than reality, whereas comedy presents them in the lower mode. This is the difference between tragedy and comedy. Keep in mind again, tragedy presents men better than reality, while comedy presents them in a lower mode. Because what is the function of comedy? To create laughter. And what is the function of tragedy? It creates emotions like pity and fear. There are tears in the eyes of the particularly spectacles. Secondly, tragedy on the basis of its manner of imitation. First part we discussed objects of imitation. Okay, objects of imitation should be serious actions, and while in a comedy they should imitate non-serious action. Now, second part. Secondly, tragedy on the basis of its manner of imitation is different from epic, which narrating means kathan karne, narrates and does not represent through action. Thirdly, on the basis of its medium, it is different from the lyric. So, we are here discussing how tragedy is different from other forms of, particularly literature. There is a difference between tragedy and other forms of, particularly we are talking about poetry, because epic is again form of a poetry. There is a difference between tragedy and poetry. Thirdly, on the basis of its medium, it is different from lyric. The tragedy is presented in the form of action and not narration. This is very important characteristics of tragedy. Tragedy is presented in the form of action, because tragedy or comedy is performed on the stage. So when you perform, there must be action and there should not be only narration. In the form of action and not narration, it means that tragedy is acted on the stage and not merely told by one voice as in the epic. Aristotle also considers spectacular equipment. Spectacular means the persons who are watching uh, these tragedies. Spectacular equipment, costume, and setting, and does not exclude music and diction. So, what are the important factors that Aristotle has counted while discussing tragedy? First thing is spectacular equipment, then costume, then setting, and he does not exclude music and diction. Diction, bhasha shaili, language, the particular language used for drama, diction we can say it. So these are the five important things that he has covered: spectacular equipment, costume, setting, and music and diction. So we have discussed a definition given by Aristotle of what of the concept of tragedy in his treatise, very well known book discussed by critics and so many people. The name of that book was The Poetics, which discusses the nature or concept of the tragedy. Further, we can see that tragedy as an imitation of action. Aristotle inherited the word imitation. Another word for imitation is mimesis from Plato. Plato is his guru, Plato is his master. Aristotle added a new dimension to Plato's concept. Which is the new dimension he has added? He considers imitation to be the common principle of all fine arts. Imitation to be common principle of all fine arts. According to Aristotle, action of tragedy should be serious. We discussed just in a given definition of tragedy, we discussed that action of tragedy should be serious and not trivial or ludicrous, as in the case of comedy. The word complete refers to the organic unity of plot. Complete means there should be unity of plot. Plot means what? Again, outline or the story of that particular genre. Plot is the main, particularly plot is the body of form of that particular literature. The plot must have, yes, plot has certain stages: beginning, middle, and end. Thus, the action that tragedy imitates is its plot, and it must be in accordance with the laws of probability and necessity. So, while discussing about tragedy, writer or Aristotle focuses on imitation, idea of the imitation. Aristotle has taken this word from his master Plato. Which word? Imitation. And he has added new dimension to Plato's concept of imitation, and he considers that imitation to be the common principle of all fine arts. So, in all fine arts, we find imitation, and particularly when you focus on tragedy, the action of tragedy should be serious. It should not be light or humorous like comedy. Then he talks about plot. When he is talking about plot, the word complete. Complete means what? Plot should be complete. Plot has a format, beginning, middle, and end. The plot must have beginning, middle, and end, and thus action that tragedy imitates is its plot, and it must be in accordance with the laws of probability and necessity. So, today in this first part, while discussing classical criticism, we have discussed the ideas of Plato and Aristotle, who were the Greek philosophers who talked on the nature of poetry and concept of tragedy in their works. So we have discussed today uh, Aristotle's theory of particularly tragedy. He is talking about tragedy. While discussing tragedy, he has given us very beautiful and complete, we can say, this particular definition of tragedy gives us a scope and nature of tragedy. uh, we have discussed, analyzed this definition and discussed important things that are discussed by Aristotle while talking about concept of tragedy in the definition of tragedy. And we discussed objects of imitation, further imitation of action, what type of that action is. After this discussion, in the next lecture, we will discuss types of the plots of tragedy that are discussed by Aristotle. Further, we can discuss the elements of tragedy, and then we can discuss the function and the effects of tragedy in the next lecture. Thank you very much.